power, wealth, and an empire he built from the ground up. But one late-night phone call changed everything. "Hello, are you my father?" Now, he must face the past, protect his newly discovered son, and outmaneuver a dangerous enemy. Will he succeed? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The night sky of São Paulo sparkled with city lights as Eduardo Vasconcelos stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. At 45, he was at the height of his power, CEO of Vasconcelos Corp., one of Brazil's largest conglomerates. With interests spanning from real estate to technology, Eduardo loosened his Italian silk tie and checked his Rolex. It was nearly midnight, but time meant little to a man who had sacrificed everything for success. His dark hair was starting to gray at the temples, but it only added to his distinguished appearance. Women constantly pursued him, but none had captured his heart since. He pushed the thought away. That was ancient history. "Mr. Vasconcelos, I've finalized the Singapore contract," said Regina, his executive assistant, entering with a stack of papers. At 38, she was efficient, loyal, and secretly harbored feelings for her boss that went beyond professional. "Thank you, Regina. You should go home. It's late," Eduardo replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to giving orders. Regina hesitated. "Will you be leaving soon too? You've been working 16-hour days all week." Eduardo gave her a tired smile. "Just a few more emails. The Tokyo market opens soon." After Regina left, Eduardo poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey. His life was exactly as he had designed it, successful, luxurious, and completely empty. His spacious penthouse apartment waited for him, as hollow as his achievements felt lately. The phone on his desk rang, displaying an unknown international number. Eduardo frowned. At this hour, he almost let it go to voicemail, but something compelled him to answer. Eduardo Vasconcelos speaking. Silence filled the line, then a small, hesitant voice. "Hello? Are you my father?" Eduardo froze, the glass halfway to his lips. "I think you have the wrong number." "Are you Eduardo Vasconcelos?" the boy's voice asked, trembling slightly. "Yes, but—" "Then I have the right number," the child interrupted. "My name is Gabriel. My mother was Camila Oliveira." Eduardo's hand gripped the desk for support. Camila, a name he hadn't allowed himself to think about in 12 years. "That's impossible," he whispered, but memories flooded back. Camilla's smile, her laughter, the plans they'd made before his ambition had taken him away. "My mother died last week," the boy continued, his voice breaking. "Cancer. Before she died, she gave me this number. She said you're my father and that if anything happened to her, I should call you." Eduardo sank into his chair. "Where are you?" "At an orphanage in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Mama and I lived here." Argentina, where he'd met Camilla during that business conference, where they'd spent those passionate months together before he'd left, promising to return after securing his company's future, a promise he never kept. "How old are you?" Eduardo asked, already calculating in his head. 11. The timing matched perfectly. A son. He had a son he never knew existed. "The people here say I'll be put in foster care next week," Gabriel said quietly. Eduardo stood up, suddenly decisive. "Listen to me, Gabriel. I'm coming to get you tomorrow. Don't worry about anything. Do you understand?" There was a pause. "Are you really coming?" The doubt in the boy's voice cut through Eduardo's heart. "Yes," he promised. "This time, I'm coming." After hanging up, Eduardo immediately called his pilot. "Prepare the jet. We're flying to Buenos Aires at dawn." Next, he called his lawyer. "Paolo, I need emergency custody papers prepared." "Yes, it's important." "No, it can't wait until morning." As he made arrangements, his office door opened. Regina stood there with her coat on. "I thought I heard you making travel plans," she said. "Is everything okay?" Eduardo looked at her, still processing the revelation himself. "I just found out I have a son." Regina's expression cycled through shock, confusion, and something else. "Disappointment. From whom?" "Camila Oliveira," Eduardo said, the name feeling strange on his lips after so long. Recognition dawned on Regina's face. She'd been with the company long enough to remember the beautiful Argentine artist Eduardo had been involved with years ago. She never told you? Eduardo shook his head. She died last week. The boy, Gabriel, is alone in an orphanage in Buenos Aires. Regina set down her purse. What can I do to help? By morning, Eduardo's private jet was soaring over South America. He stared out the window, his mind racing. What would he say to this child? How could he explain his absence? What if Gabriel hated him? The orphanage was a grey, institutional building in a modest neighborhood. Eduardo, dressed in his $1,000 suit, felt conspicuously out of place as the director, Mrs. Gomez, led him through worn hallways. Gabriel is a special boy, she said. Very intelligent but quiet since his mother passed. He's been through a lot. They stopped at a small office. Wait here, please. 5 minutes later, the door opened. A thin boy with dark curly hair and eyes identical to Eduardo's stood in the doorway. He wore jeans and a faded t-shirt, clutching a worn backpack and a framed photograph. Eduardo's breath caught. It was like looking at his own childhood photos, Gabriel, he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. The boy studied him cautiously. You really came? I promised I would. Gabriel held out the photograph. It showed a younger Eduardo with his arm around a beautiful woman with curly dark hair and a radiant smile, Camilla. They were standing on a beach laughing. She kept this on her nightstand, Gabriel said. She always told me my father was a good man who didn't know about me. She wasn't angry at you. Eduardo felt tears threatening, something that hadn't happened since his own father's funeral 20 years ago. I would have come if I'd known, he said, kneeling to the boy's level. I'm so sorry about your mother. She was special. Gabriel nodded, his eyes welling with tears. I miss her. Without thinking, Eduardo pulled the boy into a hug. After a moment of stiffness, Gabriel relaxed against him. Mrs. Gomez watched with misty eyes. The paperwork is temporary custody for now. Your lawyer explained the situation, and given the circumstances, the court expedited things. You'll need to return for a formal hearing in 2 weeks. On the flight back to Brazil, Gabriel was quiet, staring wide-eyed at the luxury of the private jet. Is your house as big as this plane? He finally asked. Eduardo smiled. Bigger. You'll have your own room. Several if you want. I don't need several rooms, Gabriel said seriously. But can I have books? Mama and I had many books, but we had to sell most of them when she got sick. You can have all the books you want, Eduardo promised, feeling a pang at the thought of Camilla struggling alone. Landing in Sao Paulo, Eduardo was surprised to see Regina waiting on the tarmac with his driver. I thought you might need help, she explained, studying Gabriel with curiosity. Regina is my assistant, Eduardo told Gabriel. She keeps my life running smoothly. Hello, Gabriel, Regina said with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Welcome to Brazil. At Eduardo's penthouse, Gabriel stood in the marble foyer, looking small and out of place amid the minimalist luxury. Your room is this way, Eduardo said, leading him down a hallway. He opened the door to a guest suite bigger than most apartments. We can redecorate it however you like. Gabriel set his backpack down carefully. Where's your room? Down the hall. Could I have a room closer to yours? Gabriel asked quietly. Sometimes I get scared at night. Eduardo felt something twist in his chest. Of course. Let's look at the room next to mine instead. Later that night, after settling Gabriel in the adjacent bedroom with promises to shop for clothes and books tomorrow, Eduardo sat in his home office, staring at the photograph Gabriel had brought. Camilla looked so happy, so full of life. How had he walked away from her? His phone rang. It was Paolo, his lawyer. We have an issue, Paolo said without preamble. I've been investigating and there's another interested party in the Gabriel situation. Eduardo frowned. What do you mean? He has no other family. Camila was an only child, and her parents are deceased. It's not family, Paolo replied. It's Victor Mendes. Eduardo's blood ran cold. Victor Mendes was his bitterest business rival, a man who'd tried to destroy Vasconcelos Corp multiple times. Their feud was legendary in Brazilian business circles. What does Mendes have to do with my son? Apparently, Mendes Corporation has been funding the orphanage where Gabriel was staying for years. When they heard about you showing up, they started making inquiries. I have a source who says Mendez is planning to challenge your custody claim. Eduardo gripped the phone tightly. On what grounds? Abandonment. The fact that you never supported the child. And there's more. My source says Mendez had a connection to Camila. What kind of connection? I don't know yet. But Eduardo, be careful. You know how Mendez operates. If he wants Gabriel, it's not out of the goodness of his heart. He's planning something. After hanging up, Eduardo stood at Gabriel's bedroom door watching the boy sleep. The peaceful face, so like his own, stirred protective feelings Eduardo had never experienced before. Victor Mendez would not get his hands on Gabriel. Whatever game his enemy was playing, Eduardo would win. He had to, not for business this time, but for something far more important. In the darkness of his bedroom, Eduardo made a silent promise to Camila. He would protect their son, no matter what. He had failed her once. He would not fail her again. But as dawn approached, Eduardo couldn't shake the feeling that bringing Gabriel to Brazil had set something in motion. Something that threatened not just his business empire, but the fragile new connection with the son he never knew he had. And somewhere across São Paulo, in a penthouse as impressive as Eduardo's own, Victor Mendez was making plans that would change everything. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Eduardo's penthouse as he sat at the breakfast table watching Gabriel cautiously examine the spread before him. The boy's eyes widened at the array of fruits, pastries, and juices prepared by Eduardo's housekeeper Maria. "You can eat whatever you like," Eduardo said gently. Gabriel hesitantly reached for a pastry. "Mama and I usually just had toast." Eduardo felt another pang of regret. While he'd been living in luxury, his son and Camila had been struggling. "Mr. Vasconcelos," Maria said, entering the dining room. "Ms. Regina is here to see you." Regina walked in, dressed in a crisp business suit, tablet in hand. Her eyes softened slightly when she saw Gabriel. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you slept well, Gabriel." The boy nodded shyly. "Eduardo, we need to discuss today's schedule," Regina continued. "You have the board meeting at 10, followed by lunch with the Japanese investors and the press conference about the merger at 3. Eduardo looked at Gabriel, who was quietly eating his pastry. "Cancel everything." Regina's professional composure slipped. "Everything? But the merger announcement? Reschedule it. Today, I'm taking Gabriel shopping and then to enroll him in school." Eduardo's tone made it clear the decision was final. "Very well," Regina replied, her voice cool. "I'll make the arrangements. The board won't be pleased." "The board works for me, not the other way around," Eduardo reminded her. After Regina left, Eduardo turned to Gabriel. "Would you like to go shopping for some new clothes and books, of course?" Gabriel's eyes lit up at the mention of books, the first real excitement Eduardo had seen from him. At the exclusive shopping district, Eduardo watched as Gabriel marveled at the luxury stores. The sales assistants fawned over them, addressing Eduardo as Mr. Vasconcelos with practiced deference. "Pick whatever you like," Eduardo told Gabriel in the children's department of an upscale store. Gabriel hesitated, overwhelmed. "I don't need much." In the end, Eduardo had the store assistants select a complete wardrobe. Gabriel only showed real interest when they stopped at a bookstore where he carefully selected several novels and history books. "Your son has excellent taste in literature," the bookstore owner remarked. "Your son." The phrase sent a strange warmth through Eduardo's chest. As they left the store, Eduardo noticed a black car parked across the street. The tinted window lowered slightly, and Eduardo caught a glimpse of a face he knew well, Victor Mendez. His rival raised his coffee cup in a mock salute before the window closed and the car pulled away. Eduardo instinctively pulled Gabriel closer. "What's wrong?" Gabriel asked, sensing the tension. "Nothing," Eduardo lied. "Let's go see about your school." The São Paulo International Academy was the most prestigious school in the city, catering to the children of Brazil's elite. The headmistress, Mrs. Prado, welcomed them into her office with a smile that turned positively glowing when she heard the Vasconcelos name. "It's the middle of the semester," Eduardo explained, "but Gabriel needs to start school as soon as possible." Mrs. Prado nodded. "We don't usually accept mid-year transfers, but for the son of Eduardo Vasconcelos, we can certainly make an exception." She turned to Gabriel. What was your previous school like in Argentina, dear? It was just a regular school, Gabriel replied. Not fancy like this. We'll need to assess his academic level, Mrs. Prado told Eduardo. Perhaps he could start Monday. That will give us time to place him in the appropriate classes. As they left the school, Eduardo's phone rang. It was Paulo. I need to see you immediately, the lawyer said, his voice urgent. Alone? Eduardo looked at Gabriel. I need to make a quick stop at my office. Would you mind? At Vasconcelos Corp, employees stared openly as Eduardo led Gabriel through the lobby to the executive elevator. Whispers followed them. No one had ever seen their boss with a child before. Wait here, Eduardo told Gabriel as they reached his office suite. Regina will look after you while I speak with Paulo. Regina emerged from her office, surprise evident on her face. I didn't expect to see you today. It's an emergency meeting. Can you stay with Gabriel for a few minutes? Regina's smile was tight. Of course. In his private office, Paulo was pacing. We have a major problem. Mendez has filed for temporary guardianship of Gabriel. Eduardo slammed his fist on the desk. On what grounds? He's claiming he was Camila's benefactor for years, that he provided financial support for both her and Gabriel at her request. That's absurd. Why would Camila go to my worst enemy for help? Paulo looked uncomfortable. There's more. Mendez is suggesting that Camila approached him specifically because you rejected her when she told you she was pregnant. That's a lie. She never told me about the pregnancy. Mendez has submitted correspondence between himself and Camila dating back 11 years. Letters, emails. He's painting himself as Gabriel's unofficial godfather. Eduardo felt sick. What does the judge say? The hearing is set for next Friday. Until then, the court has ordered that Gabriel remain with you as his biological father. And after the hearing, Paulo's expression was grim. It depends on what evidence Mendez presents and whether the judge believes Camila intentionally kept Gabriel from you or if you abandoned them. Outside in the reception area, Regina sat awkwardly across from Gabriel, who was examining a large model of the Vasconcelos Corp headquarters. So, Regina began, how do you like Brazil so far? Gabriel shrugged. It's different. Everything is so big here. Your father has built an impressive life, Regina said. He's a very important man. He's not what I expected, Gabriel admitted. Mama always said he was kind but busy with his work. I thought he might be scary. Regina studied the boy. And now? What do you think of him? He seems sad, Gabriel said simply, like Mama was sometimes. Before Regina could respond, Eduardo emerged from his office, his face tense. Everything okay? Regina asked. Fine, Eduardo said shortly. Gabriel, let's go. In the car, Eduardo was quiet, his mind racing. How had Mendez known Camila? Why had she turned to him for help? And most disturbing of all, why hadn't she ever told Eduardo about their son? Are you mad at me? Gabriel asked suddenly. Eduardo turned to him, surprised. Of course not. Why would you think that? You look angry. Eduardo forced himself to relax. I'm not angry with you. I'm just thinking about work problems. Mama used to look like that when the bills came. She would try to hide it, but I knew. Eduardo felt his chest tighten. Gabriel, I want you to know something. From now on, you never have to worry about those kinds of problems again. I promise. That night, after Gabriel had gone to bed, Eduardo sat in his home office reviewing the documents Paulo had sent over. Copies of checks from Mendez to Camila, dated regularly over the past 11 years. Medical bills Mendez had paid when Gabriel was born, school tuition payments. Why had Camila accepted help from Mendez of all people? Had she known about the business rivalry? And the most painful question, why hadn't she contacted Eduardo instead? The doorbell rang, surprising Eduardo. It was nearly midnight. When he opened the door, he found Regina standing there, holding a folder. I know it's late, she said, but I found something you need to see. Eduardo led her to his office, away from Gabriel's room. What is it? Regina handed him the folder. After you left with Gabriel today, I started searching through the company archives. I remembered something about that period when you met Camila. Eduardo opened the folder to find old newspaper clippings and corporate documents. 12 years ago, when you were in Argentina for that conference, Regina explained, you were negotiating the purchase of Oliveira Mining. Eduardo nodded slowly, memories returning. Camilla's father's company, it was failing, and we were purchasing it at a discount. But the deal never went through, Regina continued. Because Victor Mendez made a competing offer, Eduardo finished, the pieces falling into place. A better offer. Jorge Oliveira sold to Mendez instead of us. And 3 months later, Regina said softly, Jorge Oliveira died of a heart attack when the Mendez Corporation stripped the company's assets and laid off all the workers. Eduardo sat heavily in his chair. Camilla blamed me. She thought I was working with Mendez to destroy her father's company. According to these records, Regina said, pointing to a document, Camilla had just discovered she was pregnant when the Mendez takeover happened. After her father's death, she apparently cut off all contact with you and went to Mendez instead, Eduardo said bitterly. But why would he help her? Regina's expression was troubled. I don't know. But it can't be coincidence that Mendez has been supporting your son all these years. Thank you for finding this, Eduardo said, his voice thick with emotion. Regina hesitated, then placed her hand over his. Eduardo, I've worked with you for 8 years. I've never seen you like this, so affected by anything. He's my son, Eduardo said simply. Yes, Regina agreed, a note of sadness in her voice. Your son with a woman you clearly never forgot. Before Eduardo could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. I had a bad dream. They both turned to see Gabriel standing there in his pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep. Regina quickly removed her hand from Eduardo's. I should go, she said, standing up. Good night, Eduardo. Good night, Gabriel. After showing Regina out, Eduardo took Gabriel back to his bedroom. Do you want to talk about your dream? He asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Gabriel shook his head. Who was that lady? Regina? She works for me. She brought me some important papers. Does she live here too? No, Eduardo said. She has her own apartment. She looks at you the way Mama's friend Elena used to look at her boyfriend, Gabriel. Observed with the startling perception of children, Eduardo changed the subject. Let's try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. Can we visit Mama's grave someday? Gabriel asked suddenly. It's in Buenos Aires. We didn't have money for a nice funeral, but the people from Mr. Mendez's company helped pay for everything. Eduardo felt a stab of guilt. Of course we can visit. And Gabriel, who is Mr. Mendez to you? He's a nice man who helped Mama sometimes. He would visit once a year and bring me presents. Mama didn't like him much, but she said we needed to. Be polite because he was generous. Eduardo's jaw tightened. Did he visit recently? Gabriel nodded. After Mama went to the hospital the last time. He said if anything happened to her, he would make sure I was taken care of. But then I found Mama's letter with your phone number, and I called you instead. Eduardo tucked Gabriel in, his mind spinning with this new information. Get some sleep now. Back in his office, Eduardo stared at the papers Regina had brought. A bitter rivalry, a misunderstanding, and a child caught in the middle. How much had Camilla suffered because of his ambition? And how was he going to protect Gabriel from whatever game Mendez was playing? His phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. Coffee tomorrow. We have much to discuss regarding our mutual interest. VM Victor Mendez wanted to meet. After 12 years of communicating only through lawyers and press releases, his enemy wanted a face-to-face conversation. Eduardo typed his reply, Café Paulo, 9 a.m. Whatever Mendez was planning, Eduardo would confront it head-on. Because now he wasn't just fighting for his company or his pride, he was fighting for his son. Across the city, Victor Mendez smiled as he read Eduardo's response. He turned to the woman sitting across from him in his dimly lit study. He agreed to meet, Mendez said. Everything is going according to plan. The woman nodded, her face hidden in shadow. And the boy? Gabriel is the key to everything, Mendez replied. By this time next week, Eduardo Vasconcelos will lose everything he cares about, his company, his reputation, and his newly discovered son. The woman leaned forward, the light revealing her face, a face that bore a striking resemblance to the woman in the photograph Gabriel had brought from Argentina. Just remember our deal, she said. I get what I want, and you get what you want. Mendez raised his glass in a toast. To the destruction of Eduardo Vasconcelos. Back at Eduardo's penthouse, Gabriel stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the glittering city. In his hand, he held the photograph of his mother and Eduardo, and in his pocket was something his mother had given him before she died, something he hadn't shown Eduardo yet, a key and a name, Isabel Montenegro. His mother's last words echoed. In his mind, find her. She knows the truth about everything. The morning air was crisp as Eduardo arrived at Café Paulo, a small establishment tucked away from the busy streets of São Paulo. He had left Gabriel at home with Maria, telling the boy he had a quick business meeting. Eduardo spotted Victor Mendez immediately. Despite being in his 60s, Mendez maintained the sharp, predatory appearance that had made him infamous in Brazilian business circles. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his expensive suit showed not a single wrinkle. Eduardo, Mendez greeted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's been too long. Eduardo sat down across from his rival. Let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want with my son? Mendez signaled for the waiter to bring coffee. Direct as always. That's what I've always admired about you. Unlike your father, who was always diplomatic. The mention of Eduardo's father made his jaw clench. Leave my father out of this. Difficult to do, considering he's the reason we're here today, Mendez replied smoothly. You do know that your father and I were once partners, don't you? Before he betrayed me and took everything? Eduardo had heard the stories, of course. His father had rarely spoken of Mendez except to warn Eduardo to never trust the man. Ancient history, Eduardo dismissed. What does any of this have to do with Gabriel? The waiter delivered their coffee and Mendez took a careful sip before continuing. 12 years ago, you were in Argentina to acquire Oliveira Mining, but it wasn't. Just a random business opportunity, was it? Your father specifically targeted Jorge Oliveira's company because he knew it would hurt me. Oliveira was my godson. Eduardo felt a chill. This was information he hadn't known. When Camila realized who you were, Mendez continued, she was devastated. She believed you had seduced her to get information about her father's company. That's not true, Eduardo protested. I didn't know about any connection between you and her family. Mendez raised an eyebrow. No? Then why did you disappear a moment the deal fell through? When I acquired the company instead? Eduardo leaned forward. I left because I had a family emergency. My father had a heart attack. By the time I returned to Argentina, Camila was gone. She left no forwarding address, no way to contact her. A convenient story, Mendez commented, but it doesn't explain why when Camila found herself pregnant and alone, the only person she felt she could turn to was me, her father's godfather, and your sworn enemy. Eduardo's hands gripped his coffee cup tightly. Why would she trust you after you destroyed her father's company and drove him to his death? Pain flashed across Mendez's face. So briefly Eduardo almost missed it. Jorge's death was a tragedy I never intended. The company was failing before I acquired it. The asset liquidation was necessary, but the stress was too much for Jorge's heart. Mendez sighed. I promised him on his deathbed that I would look after Camila. When she came to me, pregnant and heartbroken, I kept that promise. Eduardo struggled to reconcile this version of events with what he knew of Mendez. If you cared so much for Camila and Gabriel, why are you trying to take him from me now? Because Camila asked me to, Mendez said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. This is her will. In it, she names me as Gabriel's guardian in the event of her death. Eduardo felt as if he'd been punched. That's impossible. Read it yourself. Mendez slid the document across the table. She never wanted Gabriel to be with you, and now I intend to honor her wishes. Eduardo scanned the document, his heart racing. There it was in black and white, Camila's signature requesting that Victor Mendez become Gabriel's guardian. This can't be legal, Eduardo said. I'm his biological father. A father who never acknowledged him, never supported him, Mendez pointed out. In the eyes of the law, that matters, especially when the mother has explicitly stated her wishes. Eduardo handed the document back, his mind racing. If this is legitimate, why did Gabriel call me? Why did Camilla give him my number before she died? For the first time, Mendez looked uncertain. I don't know, perhaps a moment of weakness. It doesn't change the legal reality. I'll fight this, Eduardo promised. With everything I have. Mendez smiled coldly. I expected nothing less. But ask yourself this. Is dragging Gabriel through a bitter custody battle really in his best interest? The boy has just lost his mother. Does he need to lose his stability too? What do you propose? A compromise, Mendez said. Drop the merger with Asian Tech that you're planning to announce. Transfer your shares of Oliveira Mining back to me. Yes, I know you secretly acquired 15% through a shell company last year. In return, I'll withdraw my petition for guardianship. Eduardo's eyes narrowed. So that's what this is really about. Business. It's always been about business, Mendez replied. Gabriel is simply leverage. Eduardo stood up abruptly. You've miscalculated, Victor. I won't let you use my son as a pawn in your revenge scheme. Consider carefully, Eduardo, Mendez called after him. The hearing is in 3 days. I have 12 years of evidence showing I was there for Gabriel, while you were not. What do you have? Back at his penthouse, Eduardo found Gabriel sitting at the dining table with Maria, learning Portuguese phrases. Bom dia, Gabriel said carefully when Eduardo entered. Despite his troubled thoughts, Eduardo smiled. Very good. Your pronunciation is perfect. Maria excused herself, leaving father and son alone. Gabriel, Eduardo began cautiously. Can we talk? About your mother and Mr. Mendez. Gabriel set down his Portuguese workbook. Okay. Did your mother ever talk about why she contacted Mr. Mendez when she was expecting you? Gabriel thought for a moment. She said he was family, not real family, but like family. He was her papa's friend. And did she ever talk about me? About why she didn't tell me about you? Gabriel's expression became serious beyond his years. She said you had important work, that you wouldn't want to be bothered with a baby, but she always said nice things about you. She kept your picture. Eduardo felt a mix of relief and heartbreak. Camila hadn't poisoned their son against him, despite what she believed Eduardo had done. Gabriel, there's something else I need to ask you. Who is Isabel Montenegro? The boy's eyes widened. How do you know that name? I don't, that's why I'm asking. Gabriel hesitated, then pulled a small key from his pocket. Mama gave me this before she went away. She said if anything happened to her, I should find Isabel Montenegro, that she would have the answers. Answers to what? I don't know. Mama was very sick at the end. Sometimes she didn't make sense. Gabriel held out the key. It's to a safe deposit box in a bank in Buenos Aires. Mama said Isabel would know which one. Eduardo examined the small key. Another mystery. Do you know who Isabel Montenegro is? Gabriel shook his head. Mama never mentioned her before she got sick. I thought maybe she was a relative I didn't know about. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. It was Regina, looking unusually casual in jeans and a blouse. I thought I'd stop by on my way to the office, she explained. To see how you both are doing. Eduardo invited her in, noticing how she seemed to be studying Gabriel with increased interest. I brought something for you, Regina told Gabriel, handing him a wrapped package. Eduardo mentioned you like books. Gabriel unwrapped it to find a beautifully illustrated history of Brazil. Thank you, he said, his face lighting up as he flipped through the pages. Why don't you go read in the living room while I talk to Regina? Eduardo suggested. Once Gabriel was out of earshot, Eduardo filled Regina in on his meeting with Mendez and the revelation about Camilla's will. He's using Gabriel to get to you, Regina said, outraged. That's despicable, even for Mendez. What's worse is that it might work, Eduardo admitted. If the judge sees those years of support from Mendez alongside Camilla's will, we need to find something to counter it, Regina said determinedly. What about this Isabel Montenegro person? Eduardo shook his head. I have no idea who she is or how to find her. Let me help, Regina offered. I can have our investigators look into it. If she's in Argentina, we can find her. Eduardo squeezed her hand gratefully. Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you right now. Something flickered in Regina's eyes. Eduardo, The moment was interrupted by Eduardo's phone ringing. It was Paolo. "Turn on the news," the lawyer said urgently. "Channel 8. Eduardo grabbed the remote and switched on the television. A somber news anchor was speaking. Breaking news in the business world. Confidential documents have been leaked suggesting that Vasconcelos Corporation has been involved in systematic tax evasion in its Argentine operations for over a decade. CEO Eduardo Vasconcelos has been named specifically in these documents. Eduardo felt the blood drain from his face. "This is Mendes," he said to Regina. "He's making his move." "But those allegations are false," Regina protested. "Our Argentine operations are completely legal. Mendes doesn't care about the truth. He just needs the scandal." Paolo was still on the phone. "Eduardo, the Regulatory Commission is already calling for an investigation, and the judge in Gabriel's case will see this." "What do we do?" Eduardo asked, watching as the news showed footage of him leaving his office building with the headline "Corruption Allegations" scrolling beneath. "Fight back," Paolo said firmly, "but carefully. Mendes is trying to provoke you into making a mistake." After hanging up, Eduardo found Gabriel standing in the doorway, staring at the television screen with his father's face on it. "Are you in trouble?" the boy asked quietly. Eduardo turned off the TV. "No, it's just some people telling lies about me. Nothing for you to worry about." Gabriel didn't look convinced. "That's what Mama said when the men came to take our furniture. She said, not to worry, but I knew something was wrong." Eduardo knelt down to Gabriel's level. "This is different, I promise. Some business matters are complicated, but everything will be fine." Gabriel studied his father's face for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, I believe you." The simple trust in those words hit Eduardo hard. Later that evening, after Gabriel had gone to bed, Eduardo sat in his office with Regina and Paolo, planning their counter-strategy. "We need to respond to these allegations immediately," Paolo advised. "Show evidence that our Argentine operations are legitimate. And we need to find out who this Isabel Montenegro is," Regina added. "She might be our best chance of understanding what Camilla was thinking when she made that will." Eduardo's phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "The truth always comes out eventually. VM." "He's taunting me," Eduardo said, showing them the message. "Don't engage," Paolo warned. "It's what he wants." Another text came. "Through, check tomorrow's newspaper, front page." Eduardo threw the phone down in frustration. "What now?" "I'll have our PR team on standby," Paolo said, standing to leave. "Try to get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." After Paolo left, Regina lingered. "You should try to sleep," she told Eduardo gently. "You're no good to Gabriel if you're exhausted." "How can I sleep? Mendes is systematically trying to destroy everything I've built, including my relationship with my son." Regina moved closer, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this. I'm here." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the tension between them shifted. Eduardo found himself drawing Regina closer. "I've always been here," she whispered. Before Eduardo could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "I heard noises. Is everything okay?" They pulled apart quickly to find Gabriel watching them, clutching his book. "Everything's fine," Eduardo assured him. Regina was just leaving. Regina gathered her things, her cheeks flushed. "Good night, Eduardo." "Good night, Gabriel." After she left, Eduardo took Gabriel back to his room. "You and Miss Regina are friends?" Gabriel asked as Eduardo tucked him in. "Yes, good friends. She's helping me with some work problems." Gabriel yawned. "She looks at you the way Mama used to look at your picture." Eduardo sat on the edge of the bed, surprised. "What do you mean?" Sad but happy at the same time. Gabriel's eyes were growing heavy. "Mama said that was how love looks sometimes." As Gabriel drifted off to sleep, Eduardo remained by his side, thinking about Camilla, about the years they had lost, and about the son who observed the world with such unexpected wisdom. His phone buzzed with another text. This one included a photo, a grainy surveillance image of a woman entering a building. The message read, "Isabel Montenegro, Avenida Rosa, 1542, Buenos Aires. She's expecting you." Eduardo stared at the photo, his heart racing. The woman looked vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place her. Why would Mendez give him this information? It had to be a trap. But it might also be his only chance to uncover the truth before the custody hearing. Early the next morning, Eduardo made arrangements for his private jet. He left Gabriel in the care of Maria and his most trusted security guard, with strict instructions not to let the boy out of their sight. "Where are you going?" Gabriel asked, noticing the small overnight bag Eduardo had packed. "I need to go back to Buenos Aires for a day," Eduardo explained, "to sort out some important papers. For you to stay here permanently. Can I come? I want to visit Mama." Eduardo hesitated. "Not this time. It's going to be a quick trip, but I promise we'll go together soon." Gabriel's face fell, but he nodded. "Will you be back tomorrow?" "Yes. And when I return, we'll go to that football game you wanted to see." Gabriel brightened slightly. "Real promise?" "Real promise." As Eduardo's jet took off for Argentina, Regina arrived at the office to find the place in chaos. Reporters were camped outside, and the phones were ringing constantly. "Where is Eduardo?" the board chairman demanded when he saw Regina. "He had an urgent personal matter to attend to," she replied carefully. "Personal matter?" "The company is facing a major scandal, and he disappears." The chairman was furious. "The board is calling an emergency meeting. We need him here now." Regina felt torn between her loyalty to Eduardo and her responsibility to the company. "I'll try to reach him," but Eduardo wasn't answering his phone. He had deliberately left it in airplane mode, knowing he needed to focus solely on the task ahead. As his jet began its descent into Buenos Aires, Eduardo stared out the window at the city where his life had changed forever. First when he met Camila, and now as he searched for answers about the son he never knew he had. The address Mendez had sent led to a modest apartment building in a middle-class neighborhood. Eduardo approached cautiously, aware he could be walking into a trap. He knocked on the door of apartment 3B. After a moment, it opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, her dark hair streaked with gray. "Isabel Montenegro?" Eduardo asked. The woman nodded, studying him with eyes that seemed to look right through him. "Eduardo Vasconcelos. I've been waiting 12 years for this moment. You know who I am?" "Of course." "Camila showed me your picture many times." Isabel stepped aside. "Come in. There's much to explain and not much time." Inside, the apartment was simply furnished but spotless. Photographs lined the walls, many of them showing Camila and Gabriel. "At different ages, you were close to them," Eduardo observed. "Camila was like a daughter to me," Isabel confirmed. "I was her father's secretary for 20 years. When Jorge died and Camila fled to Argentina, I followed to help her." "And Gabriel?" Isabel's expression softened. "I've been part of his life since he was born. He calls me Tia Isabel." "Then why didn't he mention you when I asked about Isabel Montenegro? Because to him I'm Isabel Fuentes. Montenegro was my maiden name, the name on the bank documents." She went to a cabinet and removed a folder. "Camila knew that if anything happened to her, Victor would try to use Gabriel against you. That's why she prepared this." Isabel handed Eduardo the folder. Inside was a notarized document dated 3 months earlier, a revised will naming Eduardo as Gabriel's guardian. "I don't understand," Eduardo said, stunned. "Mendez showed me. A will naming him as guardian. That will was from years ago before Camila knew the truth." Isabel sat down heavily. "There's something you need to know about Camila's relationship with Victor Mendez. It wasn't what you think." "What do you mean?" Isabel looked pained. "Victor didn't support Camila out of kindness or obligation to her father. He did it to control her, to keep her dependent on him, and to use Gabriel as leverage against you someday." "But why wait 12 years? Because he needed the perfect moment, when you were at your most vulnerable." Isabel leaned forward. "Victor Mendez has been planning this for years. The attack on your company, the custody battle, it's all part of his revenge." "Revenge for what? What did I ever do to him?" Isabel's eyes were sad. "Not you, your father. Antonio Vasconcelos destroyed Victor's life 30 years ago, took everything from him, his company, his reputation, and the woman he loved. My mother," Eduardo whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. Isabel nodded. Victor never forgot, never forgave, and now he's using your son to complete his revenge. Eduardo stared at the revised will in his hands. Does Mendez know about this document? No. Camilla kept it secret. She knew he was watching her. Isabel stood up and went to a small safe hidden behind a painting. There's more. Evidence of what Victor has been doing, the threats, the manipulation. Camilla documented everything as Isabel opened the safe. Eduardo's phone suddenly rang. He had finally turned it back on. It was Regina, her voice frantic. Eduardo, where are you? Something terrible has happened. His blood ran cold. What is it? Is it Gabriel? Yes, Regina's voice broke. He's gone. Maria stepped out for just a moment, and when she came back, Gabriel was missing. There was a note from Mendez. Eduardo felt the world tilting beneath him. What does it say? It says, now you understand what it feels like to lose everything you love. As Eduardo tried to process this devastating news, Isabel placed a hand on his arm, her expression grave. There's something else you should know, she said. About Gabriel, about who he really is. Eduardo looked at her, a new fear gripping his heart. What do you mean? He's my son, isn't he? Isabel's answer was cut off by the sound of breaking glass. The window behind her shattered as a bullet tore through it, striking the wall inches from Eduardo's head. Get down, he shouted, pulling Isabel to the floor as more shots rang out. Someone didn't want their conversation to continue, and Eduardo now faced the most terrifying realization of all. His enemy had his son, and the clock was ticking. Glass shattered across Isabel's small living room as more bullets flew through the windows. Eduardo pulled Isabel behind the sofa for cover. Who's shooting at us? He shouted over the noise. Mendez's men, Isabel gasped, clutching her side. He must have followed you. Eduardo noticed with horror that blood was seeping through Isabel's fingers. You're hit! It's just a graze, she insisted, though her face had gone pale. We need to get out of here. There's a back exit through the kitchen. Eduardo helped Isabel to her feet, grabbing the folder with Camilla's revised will and the documents from the safe. They made their way to the kitchen as more shots tore through the apartment. What were you going to tell me about Gabriel? Eduardo asked as they reached the back door. Isabel's eyes were pained. Not now. First, we must get somewhere safe. They slipped out into a narrow alleyway behind the building. Eduardo could hear sirens in the distance. Neighbors must have called the police. My car is parked 2 blocks away, Eduardo said, supporting Isabel as they hurried down the alley. Can you make it? Isabel nodded grimly, pressing a kitchen towel against her wound. Once they reached Eduardo's rental car, he helped Isabel into the passenger seat and quickly drove away from the scene. In the rearview mirror, he could see police cars pulling up to the apartment building. Where should we go? Eduardo asked. A hospital. No hospitals, Isabel said firmly. Mendez has people everywhere. Take me to Calle Verdura 238. My sister lives there. She was a nurse. She can help me. As Eduardo navigated through the Buenos Aires traffic, his phone rang. It was Regina again. Any news about Gabriel? He asked immediately. Nothing yet. Regina's voice was tense. But the police are looking for him. They've issued an alert at all airports and border crossings. Eduardo, what's going on? Who would take Gabriel? Victor Mendez, Eduardo said, grimly. He's using my son to destroy me. Your son. Regina sounded confused. Eduardo, there's something strange happening here. The police asked for Gabriel's birth certificate, and I had to search through the documents Paolo had gathered. I found it, but what? There was a pause. The birth certificate doesn't list you as the father. It lists Victor Mendez. Eduardo nearly swerved off the road. That's impossible. Beside him, Isabel closed her eyes, her expression pained. It's what I was trying to tell you, she said quietly. I'll call you back, Eduardo told Regina, ending the call. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to Isabel. What's going on? Is Gabriel my son or not? Isabel looked at him directly. Biologically, yes, Gabriel is your son. The DNA would prove it without question. Then why does his birth certificate name Mendez as the father? Because Camilla was desperate and alone, Isabel explained. When she discovered she was pregnant, she tried to contact you, but you had already left Argentina. Your company told her you weren't available. She believed you had abandoned her once you got what you wanted from her father's company. Eduardo shook his head. That's not what happened. My father had a heart attack. I had to return to Brazil immediately. She didn't know that, Isabel said softly. And then her father died, and she was left with nothing. Mendez approached her, offering help. He convinced her that you had been working with him all along to destroy her father. And she believed him. She was young, heartbroken, and pregnant. Mendez offered her security, a chance to provide for her child. Isabel winced as she shifted in her seat. The deal was simple. He would support her and the baby financially, and in return, she would name him as the father on the birth certificate. Why? Would he want that? At first, Camilla thought it was out of kindness, a way to give the child legitimacy and security. It was only years later that she realized the truth. Mendez was playing a long game, preparing to use Gabriel against you someday. Eduardo felt sick. When did Camilla learn the truth? About 6 months ago, Isabel said. She was already sick then. I helped her go through some old papers of her father's, and we found letters between Jorge and Victor from years ago. Letters that revealed the real history between Mendez and your father, and Mendez's plans for revenge. That's when she wrote the new will, naming you as guardian. Eduardo started the car again, heading toward Isabel's sister's address. But if what you're saying is true, legally, Gabriel could be considered Mendez's son. Only on paper, Isabel insisted. DNA would prove otherwise, but Mendez knows that a legal battle would take time. Time Gabriel doesn't have. That's why he took him, to force your hand. When they arrived at the modest house on Calle Verdura, Isabel's sister, Lucia, rushed out to help. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s, with the same kind eyes as Isabel. What happened? She gasped, seeing Isabel's blood-stained shirt. I'll explain inside, Isabel said, looking around nervously. We can't stay out in the open. Once inside, Lucia cleaned and bandaged Isabel's wound, confirming it was indeed just a graze. You were lucky, she told her sister. A few centimeters to the right, and it would have been much worse. Eduardo paced the small living room, making calls. First, to Paulo, instructing him to file emergency motions in both Brazilian and Argentine courts based on the new will. Then to his head of security, ordering him to put every available resource into finding Gabriel. Finally, his phone rang with an unknown number. Eduardo answered immediately. Vasconcelos. It was Mendez's voice, smooth and satisfied. Where is my son? Eduardo demanded. Our son, Mendez corrected him. At least that's what the birth certificate says. Gabriel is safe for now. Whether he stays that way depends on you. What do you want? The same thing I've always wanted. Justice. Revenge. Mendez's voice hardened. Your father took everything from me. Now I'm returning the favor. My father is dead, Eduardo reminded him. Whatever happened between you two has nothing to do with Gabriel. On the contrary, it has everything to do with him. There was the sound of papers shuffling. I have transfer. Documents prepared for all your shares in Vasconcelos Corp. Sign them over to me, and Gabriel returns unharmed. Eduardo gripped the phone tightly. You want my company? I want you to feel what I felt 30 years ago, Mendez replied coldly. When your father stole my company, my reputation, and the woman I loved, I want you to lose everything. Let me speak to Gabriel, Eduardo demanded. I need to know he's safe. There was a pause. Then Gabriel's voice came on the line. Hello? Gabriel, are you okay? Did they hurt you? I'm okay, Gabriel said, his voice small but steady. Mr. Mendez said I'm just visiting and I'll go home soon. Is that true? Before Eduardo could answer, Mendez came back on the line. You have until midnight to decide. I'll text you the location for the exchange. Come alone. The line went dead. Eduardo turned to find Isabel watching him, her face grave. You can't give him what he wants, she said. Once Mendez has control of your company, he'll have no reason to return Gabriel. I know, Eduardo replied, but I need to buy time. I have a plan, but I'll need your help. For the next several hours, Eduardo worked frantically, making calls, and arranging pieces of a desperate counterattack. He called Regina and explained the situation. "I need you to contact the board," he told her. "Tell them everything. We'll need their support." Eduardo, Regina hesitated. "There's something else. The woman in the security footage from your building the day Gabriel disappeared. It wasn't one of Mendez's people. It was Maria." Eduardo felt another shock. "Maria, my housekeeper. We think she's been working for Mendez all along. The police found evidence she's been feeding him information about you and Gabriel since the boy arrived." Eduardo closed his eyes, processing this new betrayal. "Find out everything you can about her, and Regina, thank you for everything." The hours ticked by. At 11:30 p.m., Eduardo's phone chimed with a text message containing GPS coordinates and instructions. "Warehouse District, Dock 17, midnight, come alone or the boy dies." Isabel insisted on coming with him despite her injury. "I know Gabriel, he trusts me. He'll be frightened." They took separate cars with Isabel following at a distance. The warehouse district was deserted at this hour, the only sounds the lapping of water against the docks and the distant hum of the city. Eduardo parked where instructed and walked the final distance on foot. The warehouse loomed ahead, a single light illuminating the entrance. As he approached, the door opened. Victor Mendez stood there, looking triumphant. "Right on time," he said. "Do you have the documents?" Eduardo held up a leather portfolio. "Where's Gabriel?" "Inside, but first the papers." Eduardo handed over the portfolio. Mendez opened it, quickly scanning the transfer documents. "Everything seems in order," he said, unable to hide his satisfaction. "You know, your father fought much harder than this. He refused to sign even when I threatened him directly." "I'm not my father," Eduardo replied evenly. "Gabriel means more to me than any company." Mendez studied him. "You really believe that, don't you? After knowing the boy for what? A week? Fascinating. Where is he?" Mendez gestured toward the interior of the warehouse. "Follow me." Inside, the vast space was mostly dark, with a single pool of light in the center. Gabriel sat on a chair, looking small and frightened, but physically unharmed. A woman stood beside him. "Maria, Eduardo's housekeeper." "Gabriel," Eduardo called, starting forward. "Not so fast," Mendez warned. "There's one more document to sign, the custody papers. You're going to formally relinquish any claim to the boy." Eduardo looked from Mendez to Gabriel, whose eyes were wide with confusion and fear. "Papa," Gabriel called uncertainly. The simple word, spoken for the first time, made Eduardo's heart constrict. "It's okay, Gabriel. Everything's going to be okay." Mendez smiled coldly. "How touching. A father-son moment. Sign the papers, and you can say a proper goodbye before we leave." Eduardo took the pen Mendez offered. "You won't get away with this." "Victor, even with my shares, the board won't let you take control." "The board is made up of pragmatists," Mendez replied confidently. "They'll accept the new reality, especially with the evidence I've manufactured against you. By this time tomorrow, you'll be not only poor but facing criminal charges." As Eduardo raised the pen, a voice rang out from the shadows. "That's enough, Victor." Everyone turned to see Isabel emerging from the darkness, and beside her, Eduardo struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. A woman who looked remarkably like Camilla, but older. "Eleanor!" Mendez's voice was shocked. "That's impossible. You're dead." The woman stepped into the light. "No, Victor. You only wished I was dead after I chose Antonio Vasconcelos over you." "Mama!" Gabriel cried, starting forward, but Maria held him back. Elena, Eduardo now recognized her as his father's second wife, who had died when Eduardo was in college, shook her head gently. "No, Gabriel, I'm not your mother, but I am your grandmother." The warehouse fell silent as everyone absorbed this revelation. "You see, Victor," Elena continued, addressing the stunned Mendez, "when you and Antonio were fighting over the company, you were also fighting over me. Antonio won both battles. I married him and the company became Vasconcelos Corp." She moved closer to Eduardo. "After Antonio died, I learned Victor was still obsessed with getting revenge. That he'd tracked down my daughter from my first marriage, Camila, and was using her and her son as part of his twisted plan. Eduardo stared at Elena in shock. Camilla was your daughter. That would make her my stepsister, Elena confirmed. Though you never knew her, she was raised by her father in Argentina after our divorce. When I married Antonio, she refused to join us in Brazil. This changes nothing, Mendez spat. I still have the boy. I still have the signed documents. Actually, came another voice as the warehouse lights suddenly blazed on, those documents won't be valid. Paolo emerged from another entrance, accompanied by several police officers. Signing under duress, kidnapping, attempted murder, the charges are adding up, Victor. Mendez reached inside his jacket, but Isabel called out, Maria! Get Gabriel away from him! To everyone's surprise, Maria immediately pulled Gabriel away from Mendez and rushed him toward Eduardo. You too? Mendez snarled at his housekeeper. Maria lifted her chin. I was never loyal to you, Victor. I've been working with Isabel from the start. Camilla was my friend. I promised to protect her son. Mendez pulled out a gun, pointing it wildly around the warehouse. Nobody moves. I still have the upper hand here. It's over, Victor, Eduardo said calmly, holding Gabriel protectively against him. The warehouse is surrounded. The police have been tracking us since we arrived, and those documents I signed, worthless. The board voted unanimously this afternoon to convert my shares to a non-transferable trust for Gabriel. For the first time, uncertainty crept into Mendez's expression. You're bluffing. The game is over, Elena said softly. After all these years, your revenge has failed. Mendez's face contorted with fury. He swung the gun toward Eduardo and Gabriel. If I can't have everything, neither can you. Several things happened at once. Maria lunged toward Mendez. Police officers shouted warnings, and Isabel threw herself directly into the line of fire as Mendez pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Isabel fell to the ground. The police swarmed Mendez, disarming him and forcing him to the ground. Tia Isabel, Gabriel cried, breaking free from Eduardo to run to the fallen woman. Eduardo knelt beside Isabel, checking her wound. There was blood spreading across her chest. We need an ambulance, he shouted. Isabel's breathing was labored, but she managed to grasp Gabriel's hand. It's okay, my dear boy. Everything will be okay now. Don't leave me, Gabriel pleaded, tears streaming down his face. Not like Mama. Isabel smiled weakly. You're with your father now. Your real father, that's what Camilla wanted. Paramedics rushed in, gently moving Gabriel aside to work on Isabel. As they lifted her onto a stretcher, she reached for Eduardo's hand. Camilla loved you, she whispered. She was going to tell you everything, but then she got sick. Promise me you'll tell Gabriel about her, about how brave she was. I promise, Eduardo said, his voice thick with emotion. As the paramedics carried Isabel away, Gabriel clung to Eduardo, sobbing. Elena approached them cautiously. Gabriel, she said gently. I know I'm a stranger to you, but I'd like to change that. I'm your grandmother. Your mother was my daughter. Gabriel looked at her through tear-filled eyes. You look like Mama. Yes, Elena smiled sadly. People always said we were very alike. Over Gabriel's head, Eduardo met Elena's gaze. Why didn't you ever tell me about Camilla being your daughter? Antonio thought it would be easier this way, Elena explained. After the business conflict with Victor, there was so much bitterness between the families. He wanted to protect you from it all. So when I met Camilla in Argentina, it was coincidence, Elena assured him. Neither of you knew the connection. I only learned about Gabriel myself a few months ago when Camilla contacted me as her illness worsened. She wanted to make sure Gabriel would be protected from Victor. As they spoke, Paolo approached. Victor Mendez is in custody. He'll be facing kidnapping charges, attempted murder, corporate espionage. The list is long. And Gabriel? Eduardo asked anxiously. Legally, with Camilla's revised will, your biological connection, and Mendez's criminal actions, I don't foresee any issues with you gaining full custody, Paolo assured him. The birth certificate can be amended. Eduardo nodded, relieved. Thank you, Paolo, for everything. There is one more thing, Paolo added. Regina has been coordinating with the authorities and the board all day. She's been remarkable. Eduardo smiled slightly. Yes, she has. 3 months later, Eduardo stood in his office looking out at the São Paulo skyline. The door opened and Regina entered with a stack of papers. The final paperwork from the restructuring, she said, placing them on his desk. The company is officially stable again. Thank you, Eduardo said, turning to face her. I couldn't have saved it without you. Regina smiled. That's what executive assistants do. Is that all we are? Boss and assistant? Eduardo asked, moving closer to her. A blush touched Regina's cheeks. What else would we be? Before Eduardo could answer, Gabriel burst into the office wearing his school uniform, his backpack slung over one shoulder. I got an A on my Portuguese test, he announced proudly. That's wonderful, Eduardo exclaimed, giving his son a hug. I told you all that studying would pay off. Isabel helped me practice, Gabriel said. She's waiting downstairs. Isabel had made a full recovery from her gunshot wound and had moved to Brazil to be near Gabriel, taking an apartment in Eduardo's building. Her testimony had been crucial in ensuring Mendez would spend many years in prison. Why don't you go down and tell her to come up? Eduardo suggested. We can all celebrate together. After Gabriel left, Eduardo turned back to Regina. Have dinner with us tonight, both of you. Like a family dinner, Regina asked hesitantly. Like a beginning, Eduardo replied, taking her hand. If you're willing. Regina's smile was answer enough. Later that evening, Eduardo sat on the terrace of his penthouse watching as Gabriel showed Elena and Isabel his school project. Regina was helping Maria set the dinner table, the two women chatting easily. Eduardo took out his wallet and removed the photograph Gabriel had brought from Argentina, the one of him and Camilla on the beach. He studied Camilla's smiling face, feeling not the pain of loss but gratitude for the gift she had given him. Thank you, he whispered to the photograph. Papa, Gabriel called from across the terrace. Come see what grandmother Elena gave me. Eduardo put the photograph away and went to join his son, the son he never knew he had until a phone call changed everything. As the São Paulo sunset bathed them all in golden light, Eduardo realized that sometimes the greatest treasures in life come to us in the most unexpected ways. His empire had nearly fallen, his reputation had been attacked, but he had gained something far more valuable, a family. And for the first time in his life, Eduardo Vasconcelos felt truly rich. The end.